Hello, and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today is not going to be the full-on 2-hour presentation plus Q&A, just doing a quick reaction to the news out of Iran this morning. And I just want to clarify something that I don't think I've really come out and said with clarity before. And it's just that U.S.-Iran policy is evil. It's just an evil thing. Also, just quickly, just want to thank my sister Jillian, who has volunteered at the last minute to do moderation here. Please be civil to each other. She will block people if it gets out of hand. So the news this morning we all woke up to was that a nuclear scientist was murdered in the outskirts of Tehran. This is the sort of thing that has just sort of become normal. It's just sort of normal news that an Iranian scientist is murdered, an Iranian power plant is exploded, and I think it's important that we call this what it is. It is evil. This is not a word that I often use on this channel. I try to be understanding of all actors on the world stage. But in the aggregate, not because of some sinister plot by somebody, but truly the U.S. treatment of Israel is evil. There's no other way to describe it. I don't call the Saudi or the Iranian regime actors evil. I understand that they folks in those countries operate with a certain constraints that cause them to act in certain ways. They don't really choose their own policies, the ways that they operate. They have to deal with systems that are sort of set up. I don't even consider U.S. presidents to be evil. I don't think Donald Trump is evil. I don't think Barack Obama is evil, even though those men have infinitely more freedom of motion. There's infinitely more choice in a U.S. president's office in what they do than there is in the palace of a Saudi king or the I assume palace of an Iranian leader. Even though U.S. presidents have vastly more freedom of motion to choose their actions, to choose whether or not to do evil, I don't believe that Donald Trump or Barack Obama are evil, or George W. Bush. I believe that I don't believe people are evil. People just make decisions in the system that they are given generally. But the United States, it's important to emphasize here, has infinitely more freedom of motion in what goes on in the Middle East than either Iran or Saudi Arabia does. And that's something really crucial that is just lost, that nobody ever pays attention to when we discuss these horrific things that we just keep doing to this rather poor country of 80 million people, loathed by everyone that surrounds them, and brutalized, frankly brutalized. I'm not here to defend the Iranian regime. I'm here to point out that the only reason the Iranian regime is still in power is because of actions undertaken in the United States. The hardliners in Iran and the hardliners in the United States are quite, not consciously, but are frankly allies. And they give each other power. Of course, the hardliners in the United States are infinitely more powerful. So they have infinitely larger responsibility for the evil of U.S.-Iran policy. Let me just lay out what it is I'm talking about here, because it's interesting. These actions that happen, these things that happen in Iran, that happen to Iran, are never connected together into the full picture. But what's happening in this year, in 2020, we started it off by assassinating their great national hero, Qasem Soleimani, a guy who did a lot more to defeat the Islamic State than the United States ever did. The Islamic State was essentially a U.S. proxy that got out of hand. So we murdered that guy. And that's awful, and a tremendous misstep and stupid. But that is a military figure. You can make excuses for that. What you can't really make excuses for, and this is something that's been going on throughout this year. So even if, and it's entirely possible, this news that this Iranian nuclear scientist who was murdered in Iran, almost certainly by outside elements, this news could, who knows, this time tomorrow the news could look completely different. Maybe it wasn't really what we think it is. But we do know in in the full analysis of what's been happening in Iran this year, we do know that U.S. sanctions are starving people to death. We do know that the Iranian economy, an economy of 80 million people, has been crushed, mercilessly crushed. And this is an economy that has been mercilessly crushed after the United States signed a deal with them and with most of our allies and some of our rivals across the world, saying that we would specifically not do that thing. This is evil. We are crushing the country. In more detail, there's the fact that power plants in Iran just keep exploding. You know how in the deepest fantasies of all the sort of national security freaks in the aftermath of 9/11 in the United States, they took incredible governmental powers, to the Department of Homeland Security, to other security outfits, because of this fear that what if the terrorists target our power plants and our electric grid? So you had like folks in like Topeka, Kansas, who were terrified that Al Qaeda was going to come for their coal plant. Really ridiculous stuff. There is one country in the world where that sort of thing actually happens, where the sort of terrorism that focuses on civilian infrastructure actually happens. That country is Iran. This isn't something that's disputed. This isn't conspiracy talk. This is more or less openly acknowledged. There's a layer of ambiguity where obviously the United States government and the Israeli government don't come out and say, "Hey, yeah, we're blowing up. We're doing terrorism in Iran. Isn't it great? We're blowing up their power plants." No, they don't actually come out and say it, but they get pretty damn close. That's the insane thing, is that like there was a Bloomberg columnist a couple of months back who's a pretty confirmed supporter of U.S. militarist policy, who came out and said basically like, "Oh yeah, well, I'm not going to come out and say that we're blowing up Iranian power plants, but isn't it a good thing?" I mean, this is evil. We are targeting civilians. Do you remember how Rachel Maddow famously said, "Will the Russians target our power plants in the middle of winter?" We're doing that. That was a ridiculous fantasy. We're doing that to the Iranian people. This is an evil, evil policy. Before I move on, I want to say that just there's a sort of added sort of level of ambiguity here. It's something I've been thinking about this morning. I'm sort of calling the sort of Israel two-step. There are two ways of looking at Israel's involvement in this, both of which are that they seem completely opposing, but are also, they're both based on the same fallacy. What the fallacy is this idea that Israel is the powerful actor here, that Israel is the one who's telling the United States how to act, or that Israel is, has this incredible independent range of motion beyond the United States. And that's simply not true. This is used, I call it the two-step because it's used in two ways. I think that someone who would listen to my presentation thus far would be like, hey, the United States isn't doing this. The United States isn't bragging about this. I mean, yes, we absolutely assassinated Qasem Soleimani openly, but the United States isn't openly, bombing, isn't openly assassinating Iranian scientists in Iran, isn't openly destroying Iranian power plants in Iran. The United States isn't directly doing this. That's what Israel's doing, what Israel thinks it needs to do for its security. And Israel's not even admitting that it's doing that. And that's horseshit. The idea that Israel would feel free to just sort of go and do all these insanely destructive things without U.S. approval is absurd. That assumes that Israel has more power and independence than it does. And of course, the flip side of this, that this is all the fiendish Israelis and the international cabal of Zionists who run the world, making us do things. Now, that's horseshit as well. That's bigoted anti-Semitic horseshit. Because the sad fact is that Netanyahu is just another in a long line of petty dictators that are carrying out the U.S. military-industrial complex's will. This guy is like a version of I can never remember the South Vietnamese president who Kennedy assassinated when he got irritating. I mean, that's what Netanyahu is. Netanyahu is not acting in Israel's best interest. He is acting in the best interests of the U.S. and Israeli defense companies that bribe him, that pay him, that form his network and his sources of wealth after his time in power. So that's sort of what I want to say about that Israel thing. So getting back to it, I mean, this is not something that we can blame on those nasty Israelis, because what's interesting is that the idea that Israel is this powerful actor that's acting on its own, that we're not responsible for, and this idea that Israel runs everything and organizes everything. They're both they come from the same anti-Semitic roots, and they're neither of them are true. So we've got the murderous sanctions. We've got the terrorism. Use the word. It is terrorism that the United States. It's not like Erdogan or Mike Pompeo or the Chinese government who's like, oh, anybody who disagrees with me is a terrorist. No, this is indisputable terrorism that the United States is carrying out against non-military targets in Iran. We are targeting civilian targets in Iran. We are destroying power plants. We are destroying factories. We are murdering scientists. Another key point here is that Iran does not have a nuclear program. There was a huge deal, Netanyahu came out and, does not have a nuclear weapons program. There was a huge deal. Netanyahu came out and did this big song and dance about, ooh, we discovered the truth, the proof of Iran's nuclear program. This was proof of an Iranian nuclear program dating back to 2003. And in 2003, much like Gaddafi, Iran abandoned that program because they saw the way that a weapons of mass destruction program became such a useful propaganda tool for the United States that wanted to destroy a country. So Iran backed off of that. There has been no conclusive documentation from anybody that there has been a nuclear weapons program from Iran since 2003. And Obama put a tremendous amount of pressure on Iran multilaterally to come up with an Iran nuclear deal that ensured that Iran's nuclear program, not a nuclear arms program, nuclear program, remained a civilian nuclear program. It was a carefully put together, laboriously put together deal called the JCPOA. And while I think that Obama has just as much evil on his head as Donald Trump does, for sure. What Obama did in Libya was insane, demented, and extraordinarily destructive. There are now, in the name of saving Benghazi, which was later destroyed by a CIA employee, former CIA employee named Haftar. There are open slave markets in Libya. The destruction of Syria was something that is the responsibility of the United States and Barack Obama. However, the Iran nuclear deal was an effort, a serious effort, to end this extraordinarily evil U.S. policy against Iran. It's gotten more ridiculous and worse over the past 4 years with the abandonment of that deal that Iran was forced into, but it's been an issue for 40 years. What's fascinating is if you look at the history of U.S.-Iranian policy, which of course nobody in journalism in the United States wants to do, if you actually look at that history, the second a U.S. president or U.S. government lets up on Iran a little, the Iranian regime, theocratic regime, which my understanding is most Iranians strongly dislike, instantly starts to wobble. In the 90s, you had President Khatami, who was a reformist, who really wanted to open things up again. Unfortunately, after 9/11, despite the fact that the country most responsible for 9/11 was Saudi Arabia, the United States decided that it had the right to just go destroy a bunch of countries that it always wanted to destroy in alliance with Saudi Arabia. The overtures from the Iranian people who really wanted to work with us, from the Iranian government, the Iranian regime wanted to work with us against the Taliban, wanted to work with us against Al-Qaeda, and George W. Bush declared war on them in the axis of evil speech in 2002. So it's always been insane. So in the 90s, there was this brief opening when Clinton couldn't give a shit, and then for that magical 2 years between at the beginning of Obama's presidency, where he was like, no, we're gonna be open to Iran. And what's incredible, if some of you might remember the Green Movement, cropped up almost immediately. Iran looked seriously shaky. They had to be tremendously repressive to, in the aftermath of an election. Iran has elections, by the way, to keep the regime fully in power. But then Obama decided to attempt to overthrow Assad in Syria. This is Assad in Syria. It's fascinating. You read about this and you get this sense that it's this pathologically evil thing that Iran and its proxy Hezbollah decided to support one of their only allies in the entire world. That it's this idea that, oh, these sinister, what are these, this terrible thing that Iran is doing in the region? You know, I wouldn't put it in exactly these terms, but honestly, if you flip it around, what Iran is doing is supporting one of its only allies in the world in the face of overwhelming odds. This is kind of like, honestly, this is kind of like Battle of Britain shit. You know, this is like the Berlin airlift. This is like the U.S. saving Israel during the Yom Kippur War. It is heroic what, you know, from one perspective, what the Iranians are doing for the Syrian government. And they won. It's kind of an extraordinary story of facing up against extraordinary odds. Billions of dollars of jihadists carted into Syria by the U.S.'s Gulf allies and by the United States itself. But what's fascinating is before Obama decided to do that in 2011, you know, those brief moments, those 2 years, 2009 and 2010, when the United States wasn't whole hog going after Iran, the Iranian regime got shaky. So it's not only is U.S. policy towards Iran evil, it is insanely stupid. It's utterly counterproductive. The only thing that it yields is death, destruction, and profits for the U.S. military-industrial complex. It's vital to both the United States and to Israel that this evil U.S. policy continues, because there aren't that many enemies for the United States anymore. And that's the importance of Iran. The only justification for that's left for this massive garrisoning of the Middle East that we're doing, which even if you're someone who's a U.S. hawk and is, you know, really believes everything that's said about China's threat to the United States, even if you believe that, it's fucking idiotic that we've got, you know, I think estimates vary, something like 60,000 U.S. troops across, you know, the dozen or so countries of the Middle East right now. And the only thing they're doing there is maintaining this evil policy against Iran, which at the end of the day is a not particularly wealthy country surrounded by enemies without much in the way of capabilities. It's really quite extraordinary. And I think I've made clear just how extraordinarily angry U.S.-Iran policy makes me. This is something that I've sort of been looking for a way to sort of get this out there for quite some time, and the fact that it looks like the United States assassinated. And by the way, when I say that, you know, yes, it seems like the United States, through the pathway of Israel and the Mossad, may have assassinated a nuclear scientist in I think it's a small city outside of Tehran. When I say that, you know, there's the dodge of, well, you know, this was Israel's policy. This wasn't the United States' policy. And that sort of illustrates the extraordinary double standard in the way that these issues are reported. Hezbollah is an independent organization from Iran. It is heavily supported from Iran. I think it is completely legitimate to see Hezbollah as largely a tool of Iranian foreign policy. That makes sense to me. The Houthis are very much an independent group that takes a lot of money and funding from Iran. But we're expected to see the entire war in Yemen that has killed hundreds of thousands of people, probably. We're expected to just see that as about the Iranians versus the Saudis. But what Israel does is somehow independent. It's not. We most probably make sure it's through a couple levels of affiliation or proxies or whatever, but we murdered an Iranian scientist today. An Iranian scientist who was working on a civilian nuclear program. This is something, there are inspectors on the ground there. Like it's just this incredible fantasy world that we're asked to live in. So I've ranted about this for about 20 minutes. I'd like to talk about now is hope, because I do believe there is real, indisputable hope here, that we need to cherish, and we need to cherish this hope, and we need to uh, make it possible. It's like a very delicate sprig. It's a very delicate flower that needs to be nurtured and improved and brought up, and that is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. This is a potential way out of this extraordinarily evil U.S. policy. It is a potential pathway out of murderous disaster. And what's interesting is I think my 20 minutes of ranting was helpful, because I think it's important to look at this conflict through what I believe to be a more honest frame than the frame that we're going to be expected to look at this through over the next 3 months. Because there's an Iranian election, again, an Iranian election in June of 2021. And what's going to happen then is, quite legitimately, after we've been trying desperately to destroy Iran for the past 2 years under Trump, and for the past 40 years, the reformist who was elected to work with us is going to lose power, and his whole faction is completely discredited by Donald Trump. That's what I was talking about, how hardliners work together. So in June of 2021, Iranian hardliners are going to win that election. So we have a very small margin of time in which the Biden administration can get back into the JCPOA fairly easily. My understanding is that obviously the Republicans in the Senate are going to make it as hard for him as possible, because Republicans love war, as do Democrats. But my understanding is that all Biden needs to do to lift some of these sanctions and technically get back into the JCPOA is do an executive order. For the first 3 months, 6 months of his presidency, we're going to see an extraordinary battle to keep Biden from doing that. And the arguments that are going to be made are not like, hey, we're evil, we like doing terrorism in Iran, and we desperately need to preserve Iran as an enemy, or our justifications for our defense budgets aren't justified anymore. Nobody's going to say that. What they're going to say is, well, really, shouldn't we hold out for a better deal? We should not hold out for a better deal. Iran has been holding out desperately for sanity in Washington, D.C., for someone that would recognize that a deal was signed and Iran satisfied all of the requirements of that deal. Even what they've done thus far, which is upping the amount of enriched uranium that they have, even that is called for in the text of the deal when the United States does not honor its commitments, as we emphatically have not been doing. So there's going to be a lot of people, the entire New York Times opinion page, all of Fox News, all of CNN, the entire Washington Post opinion page, who are going to sort of tell you, we should try to get a better deal than the complete cessation of Iran's nuclear weapons program, which didn't exist in the first place. We need a better deal than that. And what they're asking for in this better deal is they're asking for Iran to be a better actor on the world stage, which basically means they're asking for Iran to not have a foreign policy. They're asking for Iran to not support its ally in Syria. This is a ally, the Assad regime in Syria, yes, it's evil and bad, has been a staunch Iranian ally for 40 years. To ask them to not support their allies is actually exactly like asking us to not support the United Kingdom if it were invaded, or to not support Israel if it were invaded. It is insane that people in Washington, D.C. can think that after making Iran sacrifice to get into this deal that was very good for us, we can just jump out of it, put punishing murderous sanctions on Iran, and do multiple acts of domestic terrorism against civilian targets in Iran, and then say, okay, now what are you going to give us so we can jump back into this deal that was already pretty fucking bad for you? That's insane. So the requirement, our requirements, or at least for many people in DC, the requirements that they want to put on Iran to get back into this deal that wasn't that great for them anyway, are doing away with any independent foreign policy. Oh, and also they've got to get rid of their missiles. So basically, Iran isn't allowed to have any defense capability. Have I pointed out at any point during this half-hour presentation that the United States has been attacking Iran for 40 years, has been doing terrorism inside the Iranian borders? So we've also invaded and occupied two countries on Iran's borders. That's Iraq and Afghanistan. Like, so we're supposed to say, in return for you never having any kind of nuclear deterrent, you're also expected to give up your missiles and give up your alliances. It's insane. It's a way to perpetuate evil. So I think I'm guilty of this as well. I think there are a lot of people on Twitter who are really cynical about Joe Biden and the people that he has hired. That is completely justified. He has hired a lot of people who are complicit in the horror shows in Libya, the horror shows in Iraq. However, he has also hired a lot of people who are committed to getting back into the Iran nuclear deal. And I think by pillorying the Biden administration, the Biden foreign policy people, before they've even gotten into power, I think we're making it easier for them to say, you know what, fuck it, we're not getting any credit from the left or the progressives or the foreign policy restrainers. Why don't we just stay in bed with Raytheon and the defense companies the way we always have been? So I think that for this crucial first 3 months of the Biden administration, I think we should try to believe things that they've said, because the fact that Biden is committed to getting back into the JCPOA. Blinken and other people. This is the expected Secretary of State Blinken and other folks. They're all committed. There was a candidate to be Secretary of State who was one of the people who's saying what most people in Washington D.C. are saying, which is like, oh, we need to get back into. We'll get back into the deal if Iran gives us some more stuff. That guy was up for Secretary of State and was not chosen. I'm sure there's some political telegraphing going on there with that narrative that I just provided. That narrative was crafted for us. But the fact that the Biden administration wanted to craft a narrative where somebody who wanted a bigger, better deal was kicked out, was not allowed into its administration, is a positive element in and of itself. So there is a real chance that this evil U.S. policy towards Iran can stop. There's a real chance that what was initially supposed to happen with the Iran nuclear deal was that the nuclear issue was settled, that sanctions became a thing that were no longer a tool. Well, some sanctions would have always been preserved, but what was supposed to happen was that certain sanctions that were removed would provide an opening. Iran would be able to get a little bit more money, would be able to form greater ties with Western companies. And it would be the beginning of a bridge towards sanity for everybody. And if the Biden administration, in its first 3 months, jumps right back into the JCPOA, then we have a real chance before whatever deranged Republican anarchist comes to power in 2024. We'd have 4 years in which we could build up a real connection between Iran and the rest of the world. That was the whole point of the JCPOA. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge just how evil U.S. policy towards Iran has been for the past 40 years, and in the past 4 years in particular, and give the Biden administration the chance and the support to do the right thing with the JCPOA. It's important to acknowledge that this stepped up a program of terrorism and horror that we're seeing from the Trump administration in their last year is designed very carefully to sabotage any chance of long-lasting peace in the region. That's what it's designed to do. And I think the Iranian, you call them a government, you call them a regime, you call them whatever. But yeah, I think the Iranian regime, the mad mullahs, have shown extraordinary restraint over the past year in not letting this tip over into the US's next trillion-dollar war. And I think we need in the United States to encourage the Biden administration to take the opportunity, for a win, the opportunity um, to end this evil, evil era in the Middle East. And I think the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, colloquially known as the Iran nuclear deal, is the way to move forward. It is the way to make a step forward. And I think that, by April, if the Biden administration has whiffed this chance, if they have chosen not to do that, I will be exactly as angry an opponent of them as I was of Donald Trump. But they deserve the chance because this is an evil thing, U.S. policy towards Iran, and it must stop. Because the alternative at this point is another horrific trillion-dollar war, and it's just not worth it. All right, that's it. Thanks to my sister Jillian for doing the moderating. And this is I did see one super chat. Thank you for that. But this is intended to be a quick half hour, not to be a long-term question thing. Mike Nogozone says, I was actually in Syria when Soleimani was assassinated. Luckily, the Syrian people differentiate between Americans and the government. It's true. The U.S. government does not, because, our policy is evil. Anyway, thank you so much for chiming in. I will be doing a longer live chat for patrons only in probably next Saturday. I will see you there. And then I'll do a big, massive 2-hour live chat, usually, at some point halfway through December. Thank you all, and to all, well, happy Thanksgiving.